He fired her over a spilled cup of coffee and a dying man. He didn't know that man was the king of the road. Watch how the Brotherhood returned to teach a cruel boss a lesson he'll never forget, and gave this waitress a tip worth more than the entire restaurant. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. The Nevada sun hung in the sky like a white-hot coin that refused to set. It baked the asphalt of Interstate 80 until the air above the road shimmered in a hallucinogenic dance of heat and exhaust fumes. In the middle of this desolate ocean of sand and scrub brush sat the Rusty Skillet. It was a diner that had seen better decades, let alone better days. The neon sign buzzed with the irritating drone of a dying insect, and the letter K flickered with a desperate irregularity. Inside this oven of commerce was Maggie Sullivan. She was 32 years old, but her eyes carried the weight of a soul that had lived 1,000 years of worry. Before we dive deeper into Emma S.'s story, I want to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your city and country in the comments right now. Maggie wiped the counter with a rag that smelled of bleach and old grease. Her hands were red and chapped from harsh chemicals and the relentless friction of cleaning up after strangers. She paused for a second to rub the small of her back where a dull ache had taken up permanent residence since her husband died 2 years ago. The grief was a physical thing that sat on her chest like a concrete block. It made every breath a conscious effort. She looked out the window at the heat waves rising from the parking lot and felt a profound sense of isolation. The desert was vast and open, but Maggie felt as though the walls of her life were closing in on her inch by agonizing inch. Every time the phone rang in the back office or at her small rental house, her heart would hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew who was on the other end of the line. It was always the debt collectors. They were faceless voices demanding money she simply did not have. The medical bills from the accident that took her husband had swallowed their savings and then swallowed their future. Now those bills were hungry for her dignity. She lived in a state of constant high-alert terror. She was afraid to open her mailbox. She was afraid to answer her door. She was afraid that one day she would come home and find a padlock on the gate and her children standing on the curb with their backpacks. Her children were the only reason she was still standing upright. She had a boy of 8 and a girl of 6 who still looked for their father in every tall man they saw. Maggie would look at their sleeping faces when she got home late at night and feel a surge of love so powerful it almost hurt. But that love was immediately chased by a crushing guilt. She could not give them the life they deserved. She was raising them on discount cereal and second-hand clothes. She was forced to leave them alone too often while she worked double shifts at this purgatory of a diner. She was fighting a war against poverty, and every day felt like a losing battle. The Rusty Skillet was not a place where hope came to visit. The air conditioner rattled and wheezed, but it did little to combat the stifling heat that rolled off the grill. The air was thick with the smell of burnt bacon and stale coffee and diesel fuel. It was a smell that clung to Maggie's hair and skin long after she clocked out. It was the scent of desperation. Customers here were mostly long-haul truckers and weary travelers who wanted to eat quickly and forget they were ever there. They rarely looked the waitress in the eye. To them, she was just a pair of hands delivering calories. She was a fixture of the roadside landscape, as invisible and forgettable as a mile marker. Despite the grime and the indifference of the world, Maggie refused to let the darkness consume her completely. She possessed a stubborn kindness that confused the regulars. When a trucker looked particularly weary, she would refill his coffee without being asked and offer a genuine smile that reached her tired eyes. She would ask how they were doing, and she would actually wait for the answer. It was a small act of rebellion against the cruelty of her circumstances. She believed that if she stopped caring, she would truly lose everything. Her kindness was the only currency she had left to give, and she spent it freely even when she received nothing in return. Her physical exhaustion was a constant companion that whispered to her every time she took a step. Her feet were swollen inside cheap orthopedic shoes that had lost their support months ago. Varicose veins were beginning to map out blue rivers of pain on her calves from standing for 10 hours a day. Her shoulders were knotted with tension that never released, yet she moved with a practiced efficiency. She balanced heavy trays of fried food and navigated the narrow aisles between the vinyl booths without spilling a drop. She was a machine, fueled by necessity. She pushed her body beyond its limits because the alternative was homelessness and the disintegration of her family unit. Outside in the employee section of the parking lot sat her lifeline. It was a rust bucket sedan with over 200,000 miles on the odometer and a transmission that slipped every time it shifted into third gear. Every morning when she turned the key, she held her breath and prayed to a God she was not sure was listening. If that car died, her life would collapse. There was no public transport out here in the emptiness. No car meant no job. No job meant no food. The fragility of her existence was terrified her. She was one flat tire or one blown gasket away from total ruin. The car was a symbol of her tenuous grip on survival. The isolation of the desert setting mirrored the isolation in her soul. You could scream out here and the sound would just dissolve into the dry air without anyone hearing it. Maggie often felt like screaming. She felt like screaming at the unfairness of losing a good husband to a workplace accident that the company refused to take responsibility for. She felt like screaming at the bank managers who looked at her with pity but denied her loans. She felt like screaming at the customers who left a 50-cent tip on a $30 bill, but she swallowed the screams. She pushed them down into the pit of her stomach, where they turned into ulcers and sleepless nights. Looming over all of this was the constant threat of her employer. He was a man who viewed his staff as thieves waiting to be caught. He watched the security cameras with the obsession of a hawk hunting a field mouse. He had threatened to fire Maggie 3 times this week alone for infractions that were entirely imaginary. She walked on eggshells around him. She lowered her head and took his verbal abuse because she had no leverage. She needed the meager paycheck he signed. She was trapped in a cycle of exploitation and fear. But even in this pit of despair, Maggie Sullivan was about to show the world exactly what she was made of. The oppressive silence of the desert afternoon was suddenly shattered by a mechanical roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the diner. It was a deep and rhythmic thunder that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the silverware on the tables. The sound grew louder and more aggressive with every passing second until it felt like a physical weight pressing against the windows. Every customer in the diner froze with their forks halfway to their mouths. The primal growl of a large displacement engine announced the arrival of something dangerous. A heavy shadow fell across the glass front door and blocked out the blinding white sunlight. The atmosphere inside shifted instantly from boredom to a sharp and prickly tension. Everyone held their breath as the engine cut out and left a ringing silence in its wake. The brass bell above the door jingled with a cheerful sound that contrasted sharply with the man who stepped underneath it. He was a giant of a human being who had to duck his head to enter the establishment. His shoulders were so broad they seemed to brush both sides of the door frame. He wore a leather vest that had been weathered by wind and rain and time. On the back of the vest sat the terrifying patch of the Iron Spartans. His arms were thick trunks of muscle covered in a tapestry of faded ink and jagged scars that told stories of violence. A long white beard flowed down his chest like a waterfall of snow against the black leather. Fear rippled through the diner like an electric current passing through water. The families huddled in the booths pulled their children closer, and the truckers at the counter stared intently at their coffee cups to avoid eye contact. To these people, the man standing in the doorway was not a human being, but a symbol of chaos and lawlessness. They saw a criminal and a thug who had come to disrupt their peaceful lunch. They judged him instantly based on the leather and the size and the reputation of the club patch he wore. The air grew thick with hostility and suspicion. No one moved to greet him. They simply waited for the violence they were sure would follow. But the giant man did not move with the swagger of a predator looking for a fight. He stood swaying in the entryway with his boots scuffing against the linoleum floor. His face was not twisted in a scowl of aggression, but rather it was slack and pale beneath his tan. Sweat beaded on his forehead in large droplets that rolled down into his beard. His eyes were wide and glassy, and they darted around the room without seeming to focus on anything. He took a stumbling step forward and reached out a massive hand to steady himself against a coat rack. His breathing was a ragged and wet sound that rasped in his throat like a rusty saw. Gravity suddenly claimed the giant, and he crashed to the floor with a bone-jarring thud that made the condiment bottles jump. He landed hard on his knees before crumpling onto his side. His massive hands clawed desperately at the center of his chest, as if he were trying to tear something out of his own body. The sound of his collapse was heavy and final. He lay there, on the dirty floor, writhing in silent agony, while his boots scraped uselessly against the tiles. The intimidating figure of the biker had been reduced in a single second to a heap of suffering humanity. The room remained frozen in a paralyzed state of shock and revulsion. Mr. Vance was the first person to break the silence, and his voice was shrill with indignation. He stormed out from behind the cash register with a look of pure disgust on his sweaty face. He pointed a shaking finger at the man on the floor and screamed that he wanted this drunk junkie out of his establishment immediately. He did not see a medical emergency. He saw a liability and a stain on his floor. He yelled that the man was scaring the paying customers and probably overdosing on some illegal filth. He ordered the busboy to drag the man outside to the curb so he could sleep it off in the dirt. hurt. The customers reacted with a similar lack of empathy that was chilling to witness. Instead of rushing to help a fellow human being in distress, they recoiled as if the man were contagious. Several teenagers at a corner booth pulled out their smartphones and began recording the scene. They held their screens up high to capture the best angle of the fallen biker. They were already thinking about the views and the likes they would get for posting a video of a biker collapsing. It was a grotesque display of modern detachment. The man was dying on the floor, and the world was content to watch him expire through a glowing digital screen. Maggie Sullivan saw something different from behind the counter. She saw the blue tinge coloring the man's lips and the specific way his hand clutched at his left arm. The memory of her husband's suffering in the hospital flashed before her eyes with blinding clarity. She knew this was not drugs, and she knew it was not alcohol. She recognized the terrifying mask of a massive cardiac event. The fear of the biker that paralyzed the others did not touch her. All she saw was a father or a brother or a son who was fighting for his next breath. Her maternal instinct overrode every other thought in her head. She moved before her mind had even fully processed the decision. Maggie vaulted over the low swinging gate of the counter and ignored the shrill screaming of Mr. Vance. He shouted her name and threatened her job, but his voice sounded like distant static to her ears. She ran across the dining room floor and slid onto her knees beside the fallen giant. The grease on the floor stained her uniform instantly, but she did not care. She was the only thing standing between this stranger and the void. She placed herself squarely between the man and the judging eyes of the room. When she touched him, his skin was cold and clammy, despite the heat of the day. His massive frame made her look like a child beside him, but she took command of the situation with a ferocity that surprised even her. She shouted for the trucker nearest to her to call for an ambulance immediately. The authority in her voice cut through the bystander effect, and the man scrambled for his phone. Maggie turned her attention back to the giant. She could feel the erratic and terrified fluttering of his heart beneath his ribs. He was terrified, and alone, in a room full of people who hated him. Maggie knew she had to get him air. She grabbed the thick collar of his thermal shirt and pulled with all her strength. The fabric was tough, but her adrenaline gave her the power she needed. She ripped the shirt open to expose his chest and the tangled mat of gray hair. She did not flinch at the sight of the scars or the tattoos that covered his skin. She positioned her hands on his sternum and interlaced her fingers. She leaned her weight forward and prepared to do the work that would keep his blood flowing. She whispered to him that he was going to be okay. She noticed the phones still pointed in their direction, and a surge of protective anger boiled up inside her. She looked up and glared at the teenagers with a fire in her eyes that made them lower their devices in shame. She shouted at them to have some respect and turn the cameras off. She grabbed a clean tablecloth from a nearby table and draped it over the biker's lower body to shield him from their prying eyes. She was determined to protect his dignity, even as his body failed him. He was a human being, and she would ensure he was treated like one. She began the compressions. It was exhausting work to push down on the chest of a man who was built like a tank. She counted out loud to keep the rhythm steady and consistent. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Her shoulders burned and her hair fell into her face, but she did not stop. Sweat dripped from her nose onto his chest. She poured every ounce of her energy into his failing heart. She became a manual pump for his life force. She ignored the jeers of her boss, who was still complaining about the disruption to his lunch rush. Arthur Stone drifted in and out of the darkness. That was trying to claim him. The pain in his chest was a crushing weight that made it impossible to think. He expected to die alone on a dirty floor surrounded by enemies, but then he felt small hands on his skin. He heard a voice that sounded like a melody in the chaos. He forced his eyes open for a split second and saw a face hovering above him. It was a woman with tired eyes and a halo of messy hair. She looked like an angel who had descended into hell to pull him out. The sirens finally wailed in the distance and grew louder until they filled the parking lot. The paramedics burst through the door with their equipment and rushed to Maggie's side. She did not stop her compressions until a gloved hand gently touched her shoulder and told her they had him. She fell back on her heels and gasped for air. Her arms trembled uncontrollably from the exertion. She watched as they hooked him up to machines and loaded him onto the stretcher. The giant man looked vulnerable and small, surrounded by the medical equipment. As they wheeled him out, the diner remained deathly silent. The customers looked at Maggie with a mixture of confusion and awe. She stood up slowly and smoothed down her ruined uniform. She was covered in sweat and grime and the residue of a stranger's trauma. Mr. Vance stood by the register with his face turning a shade of purple. Maggie looked at the door where the ambulance was speeding away. She did not know the man she had saved. She did not know his name or his history, but she knew that for one moment she had held back the darkness. The red taillights of the ambulance had barely faded from the horizon before Mr. Vance turned his fury upon the woman who had saved a life. He did not ask if Maggie was injured or offer her a moment to collect herself after the trauma. He marched up to her with the stride of a petty tyrant who felt his authority had been challenged. His face was twisted into a mask of indignation that was truly ugly to behold. Looked at the grease stains on her uniform and the disarray of his dining room floor with contempt. In his mind, the medical emergency was not a tragedy, but a disruption to his profit margins. He saw the empty tables where customers had fled without paying, and he decided instantly who was going to pay the price for that lost revenue. He cornered Maggie against the stainless steel counter and unleashed a verbal assault that was meant to break her spirit completely. He told her that she was fired, effective immediately, and he did not care about her excuses. He screamed that she was hired to serve burgers and not to play doctor with drug addicts on his floor. He accused her of bringing a liability into his business and exposing him to potential lawsuits. His voice was loud enough for the remaining kitchen staff to hear, but nobody stepped forward to defend her. They kept their heads down and scrubbed the grills because they were terrified of becoming his next target. The silence of her co-workers hurt Maggie almost as much as the shouting of her boss. Then came the final blow that shattered her fragile financial reality. Mr. Vance walked over to the register and punched a few keys before slamming the drawer shut with a metallic ring. He turned back to Maggie with a cruel smirk and informed her that she would not be receiving her final paycheck. He claimed that the cost of the ruined meal and the cleaning crew he would have to hire exceeded the wages she was owed. He told her she was lucky he did not sue her for damages to his reputation. It was wage theft, plain and simple, but he knew she did not have the money for a lawyer to fight him. He was robbing a widow in broad daylight. Maggie tried to protest, and her voice shook with a mixture of fear and righteous anger. She explained that she had rent due in 3 days and that her children needed to eat. She pleaded with him to be reasonable and to understand that a man was dying. Mr. Vance simply laughed in her face and pointed a finger toward the exit. He told her to get off his property before he called the sheriff to have her removed for trespassing. He stripped her of her dignity in front of the very people she had served for years. She was forced to leave her apron on the counter and walk out the door with nothing but the lint in her pockets. The walk to her car felt like a march to the gallows under the relentless Nevada sun. The heat radiated off the asphalt and burned through the thin soles of her shoes. She sat in the driver's seat of her rusting sedan and gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She did not start the engine immediately because she was hyperventilating. The panic attack she had suppressed during the emergency finally crashed over her like a tidal wave. She was unemployed and broke and completely alone. The injustice of the situation tasted like bile in her throat. She had done the right thing, and the universe had punished her for it with swift and brutal efficiency. She tried to do what responsible citizens are supposed to do in a crisis. She pulled out her cracked smartphone and dialed the local labor board to report the illegal withholding of her wages. She sat in the stifling heat of the car and listened to a robotic voice tell her that the wait time was over 2 hours. When she finally navigated the automated menu, she was told that she needed to file a form online and that an investigation could take up to 6 months. 6 months might as well have been 6 centuries. Her landlord would not wait 6 months. The electric company would not wait 6 months. The system was a bureaucratic maze designed to exhaust the poor until they gave up. Desperate for immediate help, she called the non-emergency line of the local police department. She naively believed that theft was theft regardless of whether it was done with a gun or a cash register. The dispatcher listened to her tearful explanation with a tone of bored indifference. She was told that this was a civil matter and not a criminal one. The officer explained that they could not force an employer to cut a check and that she would have to take him to small claims court. The police existed to protect property owners like Mr. Vance and not workers like Maggie. The realization that the law was not on her side was a cold bucket of water to the face. As she drove away from the diner, her phone rang again, and her heart leaped with a foolish hope that Vance had changed his mind. It was not Vance. It was the collection department of the bank that held the note on her car. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional and utterly devoid of human empathy. They were calling to inform her that she was 30 days past due and that her vehicle was now eligible for repossession. They did not care that she had just lost her job. They did not care that this car car was the only way she could take her children to school. They read from a script that demanded payment today or surrender of the asset tomorrow. Maggie tried to explain her situation to the bank representative, but she was talking to a wall. She told them about the medical bills and the widowhood and the job loss. The voice simply repeated the total amount due and asked for a debit card number. The algorithm that determined her fate did not have a variable for mercy. It only understood binary code and numbers. To the bank, she was not a mother trying to survive, but a delinquent account that needed to be liquidated. She hung up the phone and felt the walls of the world closing in around her. There was no safety net to catch her. There was only the hard concrete bottom. She drove home in a daze, and the landscape blurred past her window in a smear of brown and gray. She passed the payday loan shops and the pawnbrokers that preyed on people in her exact situation. She considered stopping at one, but she had nothing left of value to sell. Her wedding ring had gone to pay for the funeral 2 years ago. The television was an old model that nobody wanted. She was stripped bare of assets. The poverty she lived in was not just a lack of money, but a lack of options. It was a cage where every door she tried to open was locked tight by someone with more power than her. When she pulled into the driveway of her small rental house, she checked her face in the rearview mirror. She had to wipe away the tears and put on the mask of the strong mother. Her children could not know that their world was collapsing. She took a deep breath and forced a smile onto her lips that did not reach her eyes. She walked into the house and was greeted by the sound of cartoons and the innocent laughter of her kids. The sound broke her heart because she knew she could no longer protect that innocence. She was failing them, and the guilt was a physical pain in her stomach. Dinner that night was a silent affair for Maggie. While the children chattered about their day at school, she made them grilled cheese sandwiches using the last of the bread and the cheese blocks from the government assistance program. She sat there and watched them eat and pretended to not be hungry, so there would be enough for seconds if they wanted them. She drank a glass of tap water and felt the knot of anxiety tighten in her gut. She looked around the kitchen and saw the leaky faucet she couldn't afford to fix, and the light bulb that had burned out weeks ago. Every corner of the house screamed of neglect and poverty. After the children were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. The stack of bills in front of her looked like a monument to her failure. The red ink on the notices seemed to glow in the dim light. She ran the numbers in her head 1,000 times, but the math never changed. 0 minus everything still equaled ruin. She had always believed that if you worked hard and were kind to people, that things would work out. That belief died tonight at the kitchen table. She realized that the game was rigged against people like her. Being good did not pay the rent. The isolation was absolute. She had no family to call for a loan. Her friends were all in the same sinking boat she was in. The institutions that were supposed to help citizens had hung up on her or told her to fill out a form. She was a ghost in her own country. She existed only to work and pay bills, and when she could no longer do that, she was discarded. The silence of the house was heavy with the unspoken threat of eviction. She imagined the sheriff coming to put their furniture on the street. She imagined the shame of it. She imagined her children sleeping in the car until the car was taken too. She thought about the man she had saved at the diner. She wondered if he was alive or dead. A dark and bitter thought crept into her mind that scared her. She wondered if saving him had been a mistake. If she had just looked away like everyone else, she would still have a job. She would still have a paycheck coming. She hated herself for thinking it, but survival instinct was a cruel master. The system had beaten her down so low that it was making her question her own humanity. It was trying to turn her into something hard and cold, like Mr. Vance. She walked into the bedroom where her children slept and watched the rise and fall of their chests. They were sleeping the deep sleep of the safe and the loved. They trusted her completely to keep the monsters away. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks in the darkness. She whispered a silent apology to them for the hard days that were coming. She promised them she would figure something out, but she knew it was a lie. She had no moves left to make. She was checkmated by a society that valued profit over people. Maggie Sullivan went to bed fully dressed because she was too exhausted to change. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind howling outside. It sounded like a wolf trying to get in. She felt small and powerless against the vast machinery of the world. She closed her eyes and prayed for a miracle, but she did not expect one. Miracles didn't happen in this part of Nevada. Here, only the strong survived, and Maggie felt very weak. She drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of falling. She did not know that the wheels of fate were already turning in the darkness. She did not know that her act of kindness had started a chain reaction, that the bank managers and the Mr. Van Vances of the world could not comprehend. She thought she was alone, but she was wrong. While she slept in despair, a force was gathering in the desert night. It was not a government agency or a charity. It was something much older and much more dangerous. The system had failed Maggie Sullivan, but the Brotherhood had not forgotten her. The vacuum left by the law was about to be filled by something else entirely. Arthur Grizzly Stone opened his eyes in the sterile white room of the ICU and felt the fire of life returning to his veins. The beep of the heart monitor was the only sound until a nurse quietly informed him of the events that had transpired. She told him about the waitress who had saved him and how she had been discarded like trash for her heroism. The gratitude in his chest instantly curdled into a cold and dangerous fury. He reached for the phone on the bedside table with a hand that still trembled from the trauma. He dialed a number that was reserved for war. He did not say hello or ask for permission. He simply whispered 2 words into the receiver that would change everything. Ride out. The call went out through the encrypted channels and old-school telephone trees of the motorcycle club world. It traveled from Nevada to California and echoed all the way down to Arizona and New Mexico. It was not a request for a social gathering, but a mandatory summons for every patched member of the Iron Spartans and their allied clubs. The message was simple and terrifying in its clarity because it demanded total mobilization for a debt of blood. Men dropped their tools on construction sites and walked out of corporate boardrooms without a backward glance. They kissed their wives goodbye and told them not to wait up for dinner. The Brotherhood was moving, and nothing on earth could stop it. Across 3 states, the garage doors rolled up to reveal gleaming machines of chrome and steel that had been waiting for this moment. Men pulled on heavy leather vests adorned with patches that signified rank and loyalty and a history of violence. They checked fuel levels and tire pressures with the meticulous precision of soldiers preparing for battle. This was not a hobby for them, but a way of life governed by a code that the civilized world had forgotten. They strapped knives to their boots and adjusted their mirrors. They were transforming from ordinary citizens into an army of retribution. The roar of a single engine firing up was aggressive, but thousands of them starting at once was the sound of Judgment Day. The highway became a river of black leather and polished metal that stretched as far as the eye could see. The formation was tight and disciplined, with the road captains using hand signals to direct the flow of the mechanical beast. Cars pulled over to the shoulder in panic as the thunderous wave of motorcycles swept past them at 80 miles per hour. The sound was a physical assault that vibrated in the chests of anyone within a mile radius. It was the sound of an avalanche made of combustion engines. The ground literally shook beneath the weight of the convoy. This was a show of force designed to intimidate and overwhelm anyone foolish enough to stand in its way. Maggie was sitting in her living room with her head in her hands when the vibration started. The windows of her small rental house began to rattle in their frames, and the water in her glass rippled. She grabbed her children and pulled them away from the front door because she thought it was an earthquake or a tornado. The roar grew louder until it drowned out her own thoughts and filled the house with a terrifying pressure. She looked through the peephole and saw the street outside filling up with dark shapes. Panic seized her throat. She thought the debt collectors had sent a demolition crew, or that the world was finally ending. She had no idea that the cavalry had arrived. The lead bikers did not kick down her door or shout threats as she feared they would. They parked their bikes with military precision and dismounted calmly. 2 enormous men walked up the path and knocked gently on the peeling paint of the wood. When Maggie opened the door, a crack, she saw faces that were weathered but kind. They told her to get her things and her children because she was going for a ride. They explained that Grizzly had sent them and that no harm would come to her family ever again. The terror in her chest slowly untied itself and was replaced by a bewildered sense of safety. She was not being evicted. She was being collected. They escorted her to a vintage convertible that had been polished until it shone like a mirror in the sun. Maggie sat in the back seat with her children and watched in awe as the bikers formed a protective phalanx around the car. They blocked intersections so she could pass without stopping. Police officers watched from the sidelines and did not dare to intervene in such a massive display of numbers. She felt like royalty being paraded through the streets of a kingdom she didn't know she owned. For the first time in years, she held her head high. The wind in her hair felt like freedom. They were heading back to the source of her pain to wash it away. Meanwhile, at the rusty skillet, Mr. Vance was enjoying the quiet hum of the air conditioner and the smell of money. He was counting the receipts from the lunch rush and feeling smug about firing the troublemaker. He told himself that he had made a smart business decision to cut the dead weight. He believed that Maggie was already a forgotten memory and that life would go on as usual. He had no concept of the storm that was bearing down on his geographical location. He was a small man in a small kingdom who thought he was untouchable. He smiled as he stacked the dollar bills and thought about how much money he had saved on her final paycheck. The first sign of trouble for Mr. Vance was the trembling of the coffee mugs on the drying rack. They started to clink together with a rhythmic tinkling sound that grew, steadily more violent. Then the liquid in the ketchup bottles began to dance. Mr. Vance looked up from his counting with a furrowed brow and wondered if the air conditioning compressor was malfunctioning again. The low-frequency rumble that followed was felt in the soles of his feet before it was heard by his ears. It sounded like a freight train had derailed and was sliding across the desert floor directly toward his restaurant. He walked to the window to investigate, and his jaw dropped. The horizon was no longer empty desert scrub and heat waves. It was a wall of chrome that reflected the sun with blinding intensity. The sheer number of motorcycles was incomprehensible to the human mind. They filled every lane of the highway and spilled onto the dirt shoulders. It looked like an invasion force from a dystopian future. The colors of the clubs, black and gold and red, stood out against the beige of the sands. The noise was now deafening, and it rattled the plate glass windows until Mr. Vance feared they would shatter inward. He stumbled back from the window with his heart hammering against his ribs. He realized too late that this was not a random occurrence. The parking lot of the Rusty Skillet was consumed in seconds. The bikers ignored the painted lines and parked in a tight formation that blocked every exit and surrounded the building completely. There were 800 of them, and they turned the asphalt into a sea of leather. The engines were cut one by one until a heavy and ominous silence descended over the desert. The sudden lack of noise was more terrifying than the roar had been. 800 pairs of eyes were fixed on the front door of the diner. They stood with their arms crossed and their expressions grim. They were a silent jury waiting to deliver a verdict. Inside the diner, the customers who had remained were paralyzed with fear. They whispered among themselves that a gang war was about to break out. Mr. Vance was sweating profusely, and his hands shook so badly he dropped the stack of cash he was holding. He locked the front door with trembling fingers and flipped the sign to closed. He thought about calling the police, but he looked outside and saw that the bikers stretched as far as he could see. No deputy sheriff was going to drive into that ocean of men to save him. He was trapped in a prison of his own making. He hid behind the counter and prayed they would just leave. The sea of bikers suddenly parted down the middle to create a wide corridor leading to the front entrance. The vintage convertible rolled slowly through the gap and came to a stop right in front of the glass doors. Maggie stepped out of the car, and the bikers lowered their heads in a gesture of genuine respect. She looked small and fragile in her waitress uniform that she still wore, but she stood tall. Her children held her hands and looked around with wide eyes at the army of uncles who had come to protect them. The visual contrast was striking. The, softest person in the world was now backed by the hardest men on the planet. A panel van backed up to the front of the formation, and the back doors swung open. Two massive prospects lifted a wheelchair out and set it gently on the ground. Sitting in the chair was Grizzly. He looked pale, and he was hooked up to a portable oxygen tank, but his eyes were burning with a fierce light. He was wrapped in blankets, but he wore his cut over them to show his rank. He refused to look weak in front of his men. He signaled with a hand, and the prospect began to push him toward the diner door. The crowd watched in reverence as their leader prepared to balance the scales. If you believe power shouldn't protect predators, smash that like button. Your engagement proves people care more about justice than politics. The sight of these men standing up for a woman who had been bullied by the system strikes a chord in all of us because we have all felt powerless at some point. We have all faced a Mr. Vance in our lives who used his position to belittle us. But seeing the tables turn in such a spectacular fashion is a reminder that we are not alone. It reminds us that there is strength in numbers, and that true power comes from protecting the weak, not exploiting them. This is the moment we have been waiting for. One of the bikers stepped forward and kicked the locked door. The lock shattered with a crunch of metal and wood that echoed through the silent room. The door swung open and hit the wall with a bang. Mr. Vance shrieked from behind the counter. Grizzly was wheeled into the diner, and the wheels of his chair squeaked on the linoleum. He was followed by Maggie and her children, and then by the senior officers of the club. They filled the space immediately and sucked the oxygen out of the room. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and leather and righteous anger. The atmosphere was thick with the promise of consequences. Grizzly signaled for the prospect to stop the chair in the center of the war room. He slowly unhooked the oxygen mask from his face and took a ragged breath. He looked around the diner that had been the scene of his near death. He looked at the customers who had filmed him dying, and they looked away in shame. Then he fixed his gaze on the trembling form of Mr. Vance, who was peeking over the counter. Grizzly did not yell. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice that carried more weight than a scream. He told Vance to stand up and face him like a man. The command was not optional. The local community members who were inside the diner watched with bated breath. They had spent years judging these bikers bikers as criminals and degenerates. They had crossed the street to avoid them. Now they were watching these criminals display a level of honor and loyalty that was completely foreign to the town. They saw the way the bikers formed a protective circle around Maggie and her kids. They saw the tenderness with which a scary-looking man handed a bottle of water to the little girl. Their prejudices were being dismantled in real time. They realized that they had been afraid of the wrong people. The bikers lined the windows and the walls of the diner, effectively blocking out the sun. They created a human shield that separated Maggie from the cruel world she had lived in. For the first time in years, she felt completely safe. The debt collectors could not get to her here. The bank could not repossess her car here. Mr. Vance could not yell at her here. She was inside the belly of the beast, and she found it to be warm and welcoming. She looked at Grizzly, and tears welled up in her eyes. She had saved his life with a single act of kindness, and he had returned to save her life with an army. Mr. Vance stood up slowly, and his face was the color of old ash. He tried to stammer an excuse about company policy and profit margins, but his words died in his throat. He looked at the 800 men outside and the giants inside, and he knew he was finished. Grizzly raised a hand to silence the room. He reached into a saddlebag that was hanging on the back of his wheelchair. He pulled out a thick envelope and placed it on a table. He looked Vance in the eye and told him that the rules had changed. He said that this town was under new management, and the first order of business was correcting a mistake. The flood of justice had finally arrived. Grizzly cleared his throat with a sound like grinding rocks, and the entire diner fell silent to listen to his judgment. He pushed the thick envelope across the counter toward Mr. Vance with a scarred hand that brooked no argument. He explained calmly that the envelope did not contain a negotiation or a plea for mercy, but a legal notification. The Iron Spartans had visited the property owner that morning and purchased the deed to the land and the building for cash. Grizzly leaned forward and told Vance that he was now standing on private property belonging to the motorcycle club. He checked his watch and informed the trembling man that his lease had been terminated for cause-effective 1 minute ago. The hunter had become the hunted in the span of a single heartbeat. Mr. Vance looked from the legal documents to the wall of bikers and realized that his reign of terror was over. The color drained from his face until he looked like a wax figure melting in the heat. He tried to open his mouth to protest, but the weight of 800 men staring him down crushed his voice. He realized that the police he loved to threaten others with would now be used to remove him as a trespasser. His petty authority evaporated instantly in the face of true power. He scrambled to grab his personal items while his hands shook uncontrollably. He dropped his stapler and did not dare to pick it up. He was being evicted from his own kingdom by the very people he had labeled as trash. The walk to the door was the longest journey of Mr. Vance's life as he navigated the gauntlet of leather and denim. The customers who had once feared him now watched with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. He clutched a cardboard box to his chest like a shield, but it offered no protection against the humiliation. As he stepped out into the blinding Nevada sun, the heat hit him like a physical blow. The bikers outside parted silently to let him pass, but their engines revved in a synchronized growl that sounded like mocking laughter. He walked toward the highway alone and defeated, while the heavy glass door swung shut behind him and sealed his fate. The diner was cleansed of his presence. Inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly from tension to a warm and boisterous celebration of justice. Grizzly turned his wheelchair to face Maggie, who was still standing in shock near the soda fountain. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a set of keys that jingled in the silence. He held them out to her with a hand that was steady and strong. He told her that the club had no interest in running a diner and that they needed a manager they could trust. He told her that the deed was in the club's name for protection, but the business and the profits were hers. She was no longer an employee who could be fired. She was the boss. Maggie stared at the keys in his hand and felt the room spin around her in a dizzying blur. She tried to speak, but her throat was tight with an emotion she could not name. She looked at her children who were watching her with hope in their eyes. She reached out with a trembling hand and took the cold metal keys. The moment her fingers closed around them, she felt the heavy chains of her poverty snap. She was not just being given a job, but a future. She would never again have to beg for a shift or endure abuse for a paycheck. The diner was hers to mold into a place of kindness. She wept openly and unashamedly, but the bikers were not finished with their work because they knew that a building did not erase debt. One of the road captains stepped forward with a black leather helmet that was filled to the brim with cash. He explained that they had passed the hat around the circle during the ride over. Inside the helmet were thousands of dollars in small bills donated by men who knew what it was like to struggle. He dumped the mountain of cash onto the table in front of Maggie. He told told her to pay off the medical bills and the car note and to fill her fridge. The debt collectors would never call her again. She was starting from zero with a clean slate. The transformation of Maggie's reality was so total that it felt like a dream sequence. Her son ran forward and hugged Grizzly's leg, and the hardened biker patted the boy's head with surprising gentleness. Another biker took off his vest and draped it over the shoulders of Maggie's daughter. It swallowed her small frame, but she beamed with pride. Grizzly announced to the room that from this day forward, Maggie and her children were under the permanent protection of the Iron Spartans. They were family now. Anyone who wanted to trouble them would have to go through the Brotherhood first. It was a declaration of immunity from the cruelty of the world. The local customers who had witnessed the event sat in stunned silence as their worldviews were reconstructed. They looked at the men they had judged as criminals and saw acts of charity that shamed the town's churchgoers. They realized that the suit and tie of Mr. Vance had hidden a monster, while the leather and tattoos of Grizzly hid a saint. The prejudice that had divided the community began to dissolve in the face of undeniable grace. A woman who had filmed the initial incident deleted the video from her phone and walked over to put a $20 bill in the tip jar. The redemption was contagious. Outside the diner, the sun began to set and painted the desert sky in shades of purple and gold. The fleet of motorcycles sat in the parking lot like faithful steeds guarding a castle. Inside, the lights were warm, and the smell of fresh coffee replaced the scent of fear. Maggie moved behind the counter, not with the frantic energy of a servant, but with the confidence of an owner. She poured coffee for the men who had saved her and laughed at their jokes. Her children sat in a booth doing their homework surrounded by 800 new uncles. The rusty skillet had become a fortress of safety in the middle of the wasteland. Far down the road, a small figure could be seen walking along the dusty shoulder of the highway. Mr. Vance was a silhouette against the vast emptiness of the desert. He was carrying his box of office supplies and sweating in his expensive suit. He was the one who was truly poor now because he had no friends and no loyalty and no honor. He had chosen money over people, and now he had neither. The universe had balanced the scales with a poetic precision. He would eventually find a ride, but he would never find the kind of community that he had just been exiled from. He was alone in the dark. This story reminds us that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act when you are terrified. It reminds us that help often comes from the most unexpected places, and that we should never judge a book by its cover. Maggie's simple act of saving a stranger's life when she had nothing to give sparked a revolution that saved her own family. It proves that goodness is a boomerang that eventually returns to the thrower. We must remember that we are all fighting battles that others know nothing about. Be kind to the stranger in the diner. You never know who they might be. If this story moved you and restored your faith in humanity, share this video with someone who needs to remember that heroes exist. They don't always wear capes or fly through the sky. Sometimes they wear leather vests and ride loud motorcycles. Sometimes they are just a tired waitress who refuses to let a stranger die alone. We all have the power to be a hero in someone else's story. Don't let the world make you hard. Stay soft and stay kind and keep fighting for what is right. Subscribe for more stories of justice, and I will see you in the next one.